Thank you very much for that introduction. It's good to see you again, Professor, and thank you for inviting me to this discussion. I'm just going to free associate, if you don't mind, on the exciting events of August 13th and what led up to that, and implications for the wider region. What it tells us about Israel's aspirations for a wider circle of peace in the Arab world, with Arab countries rather, in the Gulf and in North Africa. And maybe, and of course, I'd also want to speak about the implications of what happened on August 13th and the development of stronger Israel-Arab relations, the implications for the Palestinians and the prospect of advancing toward a two-state solution. I can also say a little bit about relations between the United States and Israel, and how this new development of August 13th might have some impact on that relationship. And as you know, there's also a military aspect of all of this, which I'll certainly get into as well. But let me just kind of frame what happened on August 13th by talking about the events that led up to it in the previous several years. As you know, of course, the idea of expanding relations between Israel and Arab states, particularly in the Gulf, has been highly attractive to the Israeli political establishment and military establishment, intelligence establishment, and business sector for a long time. There have been, of course, there was a period in the late 1990s after the Oslo Accord, and before the start of the Second Intifada in October of 2000, there was a period of 4 or 5 or even 6 years in which there was contact, and more than contact, there was actually low-level diplomatic relations that existed between Israel and Oman and Israel and Qatar. There were Israeli offices in Doha and in Muscat. And there was limited, but there was contact with other Gulf states as well. Of course, at the same time, there was also there were Israeli offices in Tunis and in Rabat. That all ended in October of 2000 with the start of the Second Intifada. But in the years since then, since 2000, there has been continuing under-the-table contact. Certainly, intelligence agencies have been in touch with each other. There have been the occasional business people who usually have third-country passports and would travel from country to country. I was told at one point, this goes back maybe 8 or 9 years ago, that at that point there was about $1 billion, $1 billion US in business between Israel and Gulf states, all under the table. You would not see products marked "Made in Israel" on the grocery shelves in Dubai, but material had a way of making its way there through Europe and other countries. This state of affairs, this desire for relationship, I think, mutual recognition of advantages that would accrue from a relationship, but not being able to break through the Arab consensus of not establishing normal relations with Israel until the Palestinian case is closed, is settled. That existed for years. This sort of duality, this reality of a relationship, but an unacknowledged relationship. Recognition that there would be something to be gained by a more formal relationship, but not being able to break through that consensus position of the Arab League existed for year after year. What started to change over the last, I would say, 5 or 6 years, but especially over the last maybe 3, was just an increasing frustration with Palestinian leadership on the part of key Gulf states, especially. You saw the cutoff of aid to the Palestinian Authority by a couple of Gulf states. You saw Israeli offers of negotiations that were spurned. You saw the Obama administration's effort that really led to nowhere, and there was I think a certain feeling on the part of many in the Gulf, especially, that President Abbas could have done more to step forward and respond to what John Kerry was putting on the table. There was frustration with Netanyahu as well, don't get me wrong. But there was also feeling that the Palestinians weren't playing the part that they could play to their best advantage either. and that there was massive corruption, which very much irritated, I think it's fair to say, a number of Gulf states in particular. And what you started to see in more recent years was more open contact. Of course, there was a major breakthrough, really quite startling development in October of 2018, when Prime Minister Netanyahu was invited by the late Sultan Qaboos, the then Sultan of Oman, to Muscat, a formal visit for close to 48 hours with his wife and key staff people. Video that went viral of the Sultan greeting the Prime Minister of Israel, a country with which Oman does not have relations and didn't have, except for low-level relations in the 1990s. That was very significant. 2 days after Bibi Netanyahu visited Muscat, his foreign minister at the time, well, the minister responsible for foreign affairs, they didn't call it foreign minister, Yusuf Ben Alawi, was in a conference that I attended in Manama, the Manama Dialogue in Bahrain. And I had an opportunity to ask Ben Alawi in front of a group of 300 or so strategic affairs experts to explain a little bit what it meant that the Prime Minister of Israel had just visited Oman. What would be the implications of that? How would you develop into a relationship based on this very exciting, dramatic meeting? And Ben Alawi in front of in public, in front of a large audience, you can see the transcript online at IISS, spoke about the fact that, frankly, the region had made a mistake in isolating Israel over the years, that Israel was a state in the region and should have the rights and obligations of any state in the region, which was a major acknowledgement of the facts of the region, the fact that all the states would benefit from having involvement with Israel, engagement with Israel. A clear departure from the Arab League consensus that had existed up to that point. In the same period, the fall of 2018, you had 2 Israeli ministers visiting the UAE. One, the culture minister, attending a judo competition in which an Israeli athlete won a gold medal, and the Israeli national anthem was played, and she was present. You had the communications minister of Israel also visiting the UAE for a telecommunications conference, international telecommunications conference. A few months later, in June of 2019, of course, Bahrain hosted the Peace to Prosperity Conference, the Trump administration's economic aspect of a peace plan between Israelis and Palestinians. And you had the Bahraini foreign minister at the time, Sheikh Khalid bin Ahmed Al Khalifa, being interviewed on Israeli television. There were a few Israeli business people and hospital administrators and people like that. There weren't Israeli government officials per se, but it was a clear opening. A few months after that, the Bahraini foreign minister, Sheikh Khalid, was in New York attending the opening of the UN General Assembly. AJC hosted an event with Sheikh Khalid. We gave him an award for the king, actually, Architect of Peace Award, I think we called it. That wasn't a public event per se, although we had 150 people in a room, and there was a television a camera there that was for a Jewish cable system, not something that's widely known, I think. On the other hand, you can go online and Google Sheikh Khalid, AJC, and you'll find a YouTube presentation of Sheikh Khalid speaking in front of a group of 150 people in New York about the prospect of relations between his country and Israel, and the fact that Israel is a state in the region. So you had increasing signs of a real acknowledgement of the facts of life and of the advantages that would accrue to these states by having this relationship. There were other indications, other little openings. A few years back, you saw that the international, let's see, what is it, IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, the UN-affiliated UN agency that, rather the UN agency that promotes renewable energy. There was a discussion about where to base this new agency, AJC actually cooperated with the UAE in promoting the UAE as the home of this new UN agency on the strength of the promise that was made to us that should that be the case, every UN member state would have representation in the International Renewable Energy Agency. And if it was going to be based in Abu Dhabi, there would be Israeli diplomats in Abu Dhabi. And we helped, I wouldn't say that we pushed it over the line, but we certainly helped with some key countries making the case that this was the place to put this, this UN agency. We also, I should say, helped out a little bit on Capitol Hill when a few years before that, I think it was about 2010, 2011, the UAE was up for a 1-2-3 agreement, similar to the US-India civil nuclear agreement, allowing for the importation of American nuclear technology into the UAE on the strength of an agreement that was transparent and that would have no enrichment capability. The UAE would forswear enrichment. And AJC supported that as well on Capitol Hill. I'm putting myself into the story, putting AJC into the story because we were part of the story. I wouldn't say that we were the decisive element in the story, but it was clearly known on the part of the leaders of that country that they would win friends in Washington, win friends in the United States by pursuing their own best interest of having a relationship with Israel. It would have collateral benefits of having I think a stronger relationship with key players in the U.S. policy sector as well. Anyway, we now come to August 13th, in which President Trump announces with the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi and the Prime Minister of Israel that they would reach this historic agreement. We don't know exactly when this agreement will be finalized. There are some issues that need to be fleshed out. One that you've been reading about in the last couple of days has to do with the provision in US law that provides, that assures Israel that it will retain a qualitative military edge over its potential adversaries. This bars the United States from providing sophisticated weapons that would overwhelm Israeli defense capabilities to potential adversaries. The UAE, which will make peace with Israel, could be regarded as not fitting into that category. It would not be a potential adversary if it is a country at peace with Israel. This is an issue that is being fleshed out right now, and you have the Prime Minister of Israel saying that he did not approve of the notion of kind of waiving this QME stipulation to allow the UAE to purchase equipment that it very much wants, which is the F35E. I expect that this will go through. The United States is on board. There's an understanding that as part of the package that the UAE and Israel were discussing with the United States, this issue of QME was known, was understood. It was no mystery. Of course, you also saw the major stipulation regarding annexation. That annexation would be suspended, is the term of art that was applied, not off the table. Not necessarily halted, but suspended. And you had, again, I think in a way similar to the Israeli explanation in recent days about QME, that there was no approval, that the Prime Minister said a couple of days ago that these planes could go forward to Israel, to the UAE. I think there was similarly a sense that it was understood in Israel that moving forward on annexation would make it politically difficult for the UAE and for other Arab states to establish full relations with Israel. And so it was necessary to stop that move. But rather than say that we were stopping it or we were taking it off the table or we were never going to annex, they used the term suspend and made the case to political factions in Israel that care a lot about the status of the territories and about establishing Israeli sovereignty in as much of the West Bank as possible, that this would still be possible in the future, that this is just a temporary halt. I tend to think that it's a lot more than temporary, particularly if it's the desire of the Prime Minister and of the Israeli political establishment in general to have broader relations with the Arab world, not just one small but very important Gulf state, but other Gulf states and other states in the Arab world, each of which will have the same set of concerns of not wanting to be seen to be abandoning the cause of Palestinian statehood. I think they will also have the same concern and the same insistence that annexation remains suspended. And at a certain point, I think it becomes difficult to move that project forward, which is a good thing. HAC has expressed its own concerns about annexation as complicating the prospect of the already complicated prospect of advancing Israeli-Palestinian peace. I should say a few words about the reasons why it is so important for the UAE and Israel to have these relations, and why it would be important for other states in the region to have this relationship with Israel. I mean, the most obvious glaring example or issue that everyone talks about, of course, is the Iran threat. Both Israel and the Sunni Arab states feel the same level of threat from Iran. Iran has actually been responsible for attacks. You saw what happened in Saudi Arabia, the oil facilities, and shipping in the Strait of Hormuz and the Arabian Gulf. And of course, the threats that are made more or less daily by Iranian leaders about Israel, and the missiles that have been fired into Israel from positions in Syria. It's a very real threat, not to mention the Hezbollah missiles that are stationed in southern Lebanon, or actually not just southern Lebanon, southern and elsewhere in Lebanon, that pose a very substantial threat, in addition to tunnels that are being attempted. So for all of these reasons, Israel feels an existential threat from Iran, and the Gulf states, the Arab Gulf states do as well. So that's clearly a driving force, but it's not the only force. I think that if I could just use as an example this issue of the F-35s, the possibility of gaining access to a different level of American military technology is also an attraction. If this is the gateway to doing that for Gulf states, I think they're interested in that as well. But the sharing of medical technology, the sharing of cybersecurity technology that Israel has really been a world leader in, other aspects of Israeli innovation are very attractive to a number of Gulf states. You see the Saudis under Mohammed bin Salman pushing forward on a more kind of high-tech vision for at least this new city that will exist, that they're developing, that will be a kind of a high-tech hub. The UAE is interested in advancing that part of its economy as well. There are investment possibilities in Israel, Israeli startups that are attractive. We've had discussions with the Sovereign Wealth Fund in Abu Dhabi, and we understand that they look carefully at some of the prospects that exist there. So I believe that you will have an economic reason, a military reason, a political reason to move forward. And for Israel, of course, it means the prospect of wider peace, of being able to relax its guard if it has more friends in the region, and all kinds of economic and political interaction that's very attractive to Israel for obvious reasons. A word about the Palestinians and how they factor into all of this. The case that I've been making for 25 years of traveling to the Gulf and North Africa to speak to government officials and policy experts is that you're doing no favors to the Palestinians by encouraging isolation of Israel. That engaging Israel, relaxing Israeli concerns or paranoia about your intentions, will actually be a help to the Palestinians. It will assist the Palestinians by changing the atmosphere, by being able to exert influence on a country with which you now have a friendly relationship instead of an adversarial relationship, just makes good sense. And also, let's face it, the decades of trying to isolate Israel haven't helped the Palestinian cause, at all. And it's really time to try something new. And I believe that that's an argument that we're now starting to hear coming back to us. So we've heard this from Dr. Anwar Gargash, the Minister of State for Foreign Affairs of the UAE, in discussions that we've had over the last year. And you're starting to hear it elsewhere. And I believe that that's a winning argument. And I believe it will actually help the Palestinians. You've had a few voices, but not many in that society, speak up actually in favor of this UAE-Israel relationship. Professor Dajani, just a few days ago, was in the press talking about this. I would say it's still hardly a consensus position among Palestinian intellectuals and political actors. To the contrary, the official line is dismissing this and is feeling insulted by the Emiratis. But I think that will change. I very much hope it will change. And the more that you hear from Abdullah bin Zayed, from Sheikh Mohammed, from other leaders of the Emirates, about the importance of the Palestinian cause, about trying to advance Palestinian statehood, about the importance of having frozen annexation, I believe that that little by little, that wall of resistance will break down, and you will see actual you will see actual Emirati assistance on a political level to the Palestinian cause. And I believe that other states that may come down this same path, and certainly Oman is on that path, and Bahrain is on that path. It's not quite clear how quickly they will move forward. Sudan may be on that path as well, although we've heard some conflicting signals over the last week, as you know. I know Secretary Pompeo has tried very hard to juice this process and to encourage Sudanese-Israeli normalization. I think it may be a little premature given the political situation in Sudan. I think we may have to wait till the interim government is replaced by something more permanent in another year and a half or so. But there's a prospect there, and there are friends of this process in Khartoum. So I do expect that it will move forward. And I think North Africa also, less Tunisia, which had a relationship with Israel in the 90s. Political situation does not seem favorable at this point there. Morocco is a more complicated case. You have foreign affairs responsibilities, national security responsibilities lodged with the palace, not with the PJD, the party that dominates the parliament. You have opposition expressed by the prime minister the other day, but then kind of walked back a little bit a day or so later. I believe that Morocco is on its way as well, but again, I think maybe not immediately. But there is clearly a sense across the region that change is coming, and that change could be to the advantage of the people of the region and the cause of peace, and frankly also the cause of Palestinian statehood. So I'm very encouraged by what happened on August 13th and all that surrounds it. I think maybe just a word about the United States, and then I'll stop and be very happy to take questions and engage in conversation. The cause of the U.S.-Israel relationship, the cause of Israel's security, the well-being of the homeland of the Jewish people is a bipartisan concern in the United States, bipartisan support. Public of the United States supports a close relationship with Israel, a sympathy for Israel, a feeling of identification with Israel. And that exists in both parties. You have seen some tensions within the Democratic Party, certainly in the last several years. Some voices on the left of the party raising some objections to this, identification with the Palestinian cause, feeling that the mainstream of the Democratic Party has abandoned that on human rights grounds and other issues. I think there's a misunderstanding on the part of some on the left of the Democratic Party about what Israel is all about, not understanding it as a as a democratic society with an independent judiciary and an imperfect country, like every country, but one that strives to do better and is always changeable and adaptable. But I think that will continue to be, we will continue to hear these voices in the Democratic Party. We don't hear them so much in the Republican Party. There are other crazy elements in that party. We don't have to talk about that in this conversation. In every major political party, I'm afraid. But I see the mainstream of the Democratic Party and certainly the overwhelming majority of the Republican Party solidly supportive of Israel. So I don't think that's going to change. And I believe that the UAE-Israel agreement will continue to win wide support. You had President Trump, of course, trumpeting it as a huge breakthrough, and you had speakers of the Republican convention over the last two nights speaking about Middle East peace, somewhat exaggerating the impact of this, but only a little bit. It certainly moves in that direction in a way that we haven't seen much of in recent years. So it's a milestone for sure. It is historic for sure. And Vice President Biden as well greeted the UAE-Israel agreement, and that was very encouraging. And I believe that if there is a Biden victory in November, that you will have a continuation of this process. I don't think it's going to change. You have a continuation of the strong U.S.-Israel relationship. Biden himself, when he was in the Senate for decades, and when he was vice president, was a strong supporter of the U.S.-Israel relationship. And while you have some voices in the Republican convention this week, and you will hear also in ads over the next 2 months leading up to our election, voices that say that the Democrats are anti-Israel or that Obama was the most anti-Israel president ever. Don't believe it. It's not the case. There was an abstention by the United States cast in the final days of the Obama administration in a UN Security Council resolution that was critical of Israel, and that was a mistake. And it was something that we certainly objected to, and many others in the Democratic Party objected to, not just NGOs like AJC. We're nonpartisan, but not just NGOs like AJC. But I don't believe that reflects an anti-Israel sentiment. It reflects a certain frustration that existed between President Obama and the Prime Minister of Israel, more than it does reflect any fundamental change in U.S. policy. I think that policy is on a fixed course and it's going in the right direction. And I think just lastly, I have to say that the relationship between Israel and India is one that, as I know that's not the topic of this conversation, but you should know, and I think you do know, that AJC has been a strong supporter of that for decades. And it's just been an enormous honor for me to partner with Arjun and Nissim Rubin, who's on from Washington as well, and other colleagues from AJC, Shira and Dylan, I see her on this call as well from New York, to be part of the process of encouraging stronger and stronger friendship and cooperation and true partnership between these two great democratic states. Well, one really great and one that aspires to be great, and that's the small state of Israel that very much wants to continue and continue to develop this relationship with the great state of India. And I think with that, I'll stop and be happy to take your questions.
Yes. Thank you, Mr.